What if thinking, the very thing that makes us human, is also our greatest enemy? Why does a simple thought sometimes spiral into a nightmare we can't escape? The mind promises answers, but it often delivers chaos, quietly, relentlessly, without warning. This hidden trap lies within us all, waiting to unravel the moment we dare to think too much. The most fundamental quality that distinguishes us from other living beings is our ability to think. Aristotle defines humans as zoon logikon, that is, thinking animals. Being a thinking being is also one of our heaviest burdens. Our knowledge, responsibilities, and search for meaning are all determined by this criterion of thinking. In other words, the outcomes of our thinking shape who we are, determine our ontological position, guide our orientation toward metaphysical principles, and lead us to organize our lives according to these principles. We can think because we possess intellect and mind, the domain where we recognize or attempt to recognize ourselves, our surroundings, all beings, the abstract and the concrete, the existent and the non-existent, the possible and the impossible. In short, everything is our mind, the very tool that enables us to think. At first glance, the free flow of our mind and thoughts may seem beneficial to us. The ability to swim freely in this vast and boundless ocean, to think whatever we want, however we want, seemingly elevates humans to a state of grandeur, because freedom and grandeur are closely linked. However, we often fail to realize that every possibility can also contain a threat or a risk. The nature and capacity of the mind have always remained a mystery. Therefore, numerous philosophical definitions of the mind have been proposed. John Locke's definition of the mind as a blank slate is rooted in empiricism, but through this metaphor, we can better understand the relationship between our thoughts and the concepts of opportunity and threat. When we conceive of the mind as a blank slate, we attribute to it the ability to take on any form and contain all beings. This flexibility grants an unparalleled opportunity to our thoughts because this slate, our mind, has no limits in either shape or content. However, this seemingly infinite flexibility also harbors a danger: boundlessness. It is impossible for a fragile being adorned with grandeur to cope with a boundless mind, because while the ability to think about anything promises unparalleled freedom, the specter of encountering insurmountable dilemmas as the human mind constantly pushes its limits is inevitable. This boundless nature of the mind has fascinated thinkers across centuries. Take, for instance, the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who argued that the human intellect, though finite in its earthly form, has a capacity to reach toward the infinite, toward God and eternal truths. Yet, Aquinas also warned that this reach exceeds our grasp, leaving us suspended between divine potential and human limitation. This paradox amplifies the horror. The mind can conceive of infinity, but it cannot fully inhabit it. We are left dangling, aware of our potential, yet shackled by our fragility. This tension between capacity and constraint is what makes thinking both a gift and a curse, a duality that echoes through the history of human reflection. Throughout history, the horror of thinking has haunted some of humanity's greatest minds, each grappling with its implications in their own way. The ancient Stoic Seneca wrote of the mind as a restless force, capable of soaring to the heavens, yet doomed to crash against the walls of human limitation. Centuries later, Blaise Pascal, the mathematician and philosopher, famously penned his terror at the eternal silence of these infinite spaces, a reflection not just of the cosmos, but of the mind that dares to contemplate it. Pascal's pensées reveal a man tormented by thought's vastness, unable to reconcile its grandeur with the fragility of the thinker. These voices from the past remind us that the burden of thinking is not a modern invention. It is a timeless struggle etched into the human condition. The mind's capacity for self-reflection is both its crown and its curse. When this self-awareness turns inward too sharply, the mind transforms into a labyrinth, where every turn reveals not just the self, but the shadows of what we might be, or worse, what we fear we are. This recursive nature of thinking traps us in a cycle of questioning. Who am I? What am I capable of? The deeper we venture, the more we confront the unsettling truth that our thoughts can reveal not only our essence but also our abyss. Søren Kierkegaard, the existentialist pioneer, described this as the dizziness of freedom, where the mind's ability to reflect on itself becomes a spiraling descent into anxiety and dread. In this labyrinth, the horror is not just in what we find, but in the endlessness of the search itself. The mind is like a mirror, and our thoughts are its reflections in that mirror. Through thinking, we can embark on a journey of self-discovery. The flexibility of thought offers us this opportunity. However, this journey is not always illuminated. Sometimes remaining in darkness is part of the exploration. Through thought, we can reach both the known and the unknown. Just as our desires take shape in our minds, so do our fears. It is precisely at this point that we confront the frightening aspect of this vastness. While searching for truth, while running toward existential meaning, we can suddenly find ourselves in a collapse or loss without even realizing it. Because in this endless expanse, all kinds of thoughts drift freely. We seek to mold our thoughts into a form to impose order, but the mind does not recognize this order. Thoughts are elusive, resist control, and flow by their own nature. And in this flow, one inevitably encounters a stranger who sends shivers down their spine. Consider the metaphor of the mind as a vessel navigating an uncharted sea. The ancient Greeks spoke of the daemon, a guiding spirit or inner voice that accompanies each person. But what if this companion is not always benevolent? In the boundless expanse of thought, we may encounter an unseen passenger, an intruder within our own psyche. This stranger could be doubt, fear, or even a fragment of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The horror lies not just in the vastness, but in the realization that we are not alone in our own minds. This internal confrontation, often unbidden, reveals the mind's autonomy, operating beyond our conscious will and dragging us into uncharted depths. The horror of everything being thinkable stems from the flexibility of the mind and the burden this flexibility imposes on us. Yes, thinking grants freedom. The infinite possibilities of the mind constitute absolute freedom, but at the same time, an immense weight. According to Sartre, consciousness is inherently a void, and this void is the foundation of freedom. Yet, freedom casts the individual into a storm. The mind is a ship tossed in this storm, and each thought is a tremor. The mind can contemplate both existence and non-existence. Every possibility finds its place in the mind. While these possibilities may seem like freedom, they can also imprison the mind, because possibilities are not only positive or designed according to human desires, unwanted negative ones are also among them. This hidden dilemma within flexibility drags a person into an impasse, a dead end. Thus, as we push the limits of reason, every emerging thought reflects our own fragility, helplessness, and weakness like a mirror. Sigmund Freud illustrates the heavy burden of thinking through a case study with one of his patients. The patient repeatedly dreams of trying to open a door, but always ends up in the same room. Freud interprets this as a reflection of the conscious mind being forced to continuously confront an unresolved problem. He highlights how thinking, instead of bringing this individual peace, traps them in an inescapable cycle. The same issue can be seen in Carl Gustav Jung's analyses. Jung asserts that the burden of thinking is primarily spiritual and existential. He describes the mind as a battlefield, where every realization leads both to enlightenment and to an unbearable weight, emphasizing that comprehension is as destructive as it is transformative. Jung's exploration of the collective unconscious adds another layer to this burden. He believed that the mind is not merely a personal slate, but a repository of archetypes, universal symbols, and patterns inherited from humanity's past. These archetypes, such as the shadow or the trickster, emerge unbidden in our thoughts, shaping our perceptions and fears. The horror intensifies when we realize that our minds are not entirely our own. They are haunted by ancient echoes we cannot fully control. This interplay between personal thought and collective inheritance underscores the shackled nature of our freedom as we wrestle with forces older and deeper than our individual existence. Beyond philosophy, the horror of thinking finds a foothold in the biological underpinnings of the brain itself. Neuroscientists have long studied how the prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher reasoning, interacts with the amygdala, the ancient alarm system of fear. When we think too deeply, when we push into the realms of the unknown or the impossible, this interplay can trigger a visceral response, a racing heart, a tightening chest, a primal sense of unease. This is the body's way of signaling that the mind has wandered too far into territory it was not evolved to conquer. Consider the phenomenon of existential dread, a term psychologists use to describe the overwhelming anxiety that arises from contemplating life's big questions. Why do we exist? What happens after death? The brain, designed for survival, recoils from these unanswerable thoughts, yet the mind persists, drawn like a moth to the flame of its own destruction. This biological tension reveals that the horror of thinking is not merely abstract. It is wired into our very being, a clash between our animal instincts and our transcendent aspirations. Freud also claims that the mind is filled with the unconscious, that is, the hidden, the repressed, the concealed can surface. As human awareness expands, one inevitably encounters their own chaos. Thoughts cannot conceal this chaos. To better grasp the horror of everything being thinkable, it is essential to closely examine the concepts of conception and affirmation. The mind's ability to shape an idea without passing judgment is called conception. For instance, thinking about a tree, a stone, or even an impossibility without making any judgment is conception. Affirmation, on the other hand, is the mental and emotional acceptance of a conceived idea as truth. For example, forming a definitive judgment that a tree exists is affirmation. Thus, thinking actually begins with conception. The mind lays out all thoughts without questioning what to affirm, what to discard, or whether to make any judgment at all. This vastness is a gift to humanity, for humans can contemplate even what surpasses them. As thinking beings, they also possess the ability to structure this vastness within a framework, affirming certain ideas to refine their souls. But at the same time, they bear an immense burden, like Sisyphus, because conception, unrestricted by limits, has the power to bring every being, every non-being, every possibility, and every impossibility into the mind. The horror and insidious dread stem precisely from this boundlessness, the disorder within boundlessness, and the inability to control this vastness. Thinking about a bird's ability to fly is a conceivable phenomenon. The mind grasps this easily and can affirm it. However, at the same time, imagining something being both black and white simultaneously is impossible, yet the mind can conceive of this impossibility. Even though the principle two opposites cannot coexist is known, the mind can still form an image of this impossibility. This is why the ability to think about everything is terrifying, because the power of conception can momentarily present an impossible, illogical illusion as reality. This capability also condemns humans to the inconsistency of their own minds. This tension between conception and affirmation mirrors a broader philosophical debate. Immanuel Kant, for instance, distinguished between the phenomenal world, what we perceive, and the noumenal world, things as they are in themselves. The mind can conceive of the noumenal, something beyond our sensory grasp, but it cannot affirm it with certainty. This gap fuels the horror. We are tantalized by thoughts of the unknowable, yet trapped in the limits of what we can verify. Kant's insight reveals that our intellectual freedom is a double-edged sword, slicing through ignorance while wounding us with the unreachable. The terror of thinking is not just an individual experience, it ripples through the collective imagination, reflected in the stories we tell and the cultures we build. Ancient myths, like the tale of Pandora's box, warn of the dangers of curiosity, where the act of seeking knowledge unleashes chaos upon the world. In modernity, science fiction amplifies this fear. Think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where a man's relentless pursuit of thought creates a monster that destroys him. These narratives are more than mere entertainment. They are mirrors of our collective unease with the mind's power. Across civilizations, from the Greeks' hubris to the Buddhist notion of attachment to thought as suffering, we see a shared recognition. The ability to think is a double-edged sword, cutting through ignorance while carving wounds of doubt and despair. This cultural lens reveals that the horror of thinking is not ours alone. It is a thread woven into the fabric of humanity, a universal cry against the shackles of our own intellect. Through the mind, humans can grasp certain meanings regarding their own existence and the beings around them. However, this comprehension confronts them with their own helplessness, because humans are not only aware of themselves, but they are also aware of what they know and what they do not know. Al-Ghazali is known for his deep inquiries. In his autobiography, Al-Munqidh, he He recounts his relentless struggle with his mind and thoughts. In the end, he acknowledges his helplessness and expresses that he escaped this turmoil through a divine light that descended upon his heart. Al-Ghazali views reason as both a blessing and a trap. The mind has the capacity to grasp divine truths, but it is also the target of satanic whispers. The vastness of thinking can summon both doubt and delusion. This crossroads is crucial for a person with free will. For the mind, divine truths and the temptations of the ego are equally accessible. It can conceive of both paths. Al-Ghazali's experience resonates with other mystical traditions. The 13th century poet Rumi, for example, likened the mind to a restless bird flitting between branches of truth and illusion. He urged seekers to transcend thought through surrender to a higher reality, suggesting that the mind's vastness is a labyrinth that only divine guidance can navigate. This mystical lens amplifies the horror of thinking. Without an anchor, we are adrift in a sea of endless possibilities, each wave threatening to drown us in doubt or despair. Thus, while seeking truth and meaning, a person suddenly finds themselves entangled in a web of thoughts due to the vastness of conception. Just as one contemplates the existence of a creator with countless proofs, the mind simultaneously conjures up meaningless doubts. The fact that everything can be thought about can lead one to meaning, but it can also leave them in endless uncertainty. This struggle is not confined to ancient philosophy or mysticism. It reverberates in our modern world. Consider the rise of information overload in the digital age. The internet floods our minds with endless data, each click a new thought, each scroll a new possibility. Psychologists like Daniel Kahneman have noted how this deluge overwhelms our cognitive capacity, trapping us in a cycle of indecision and anxiety. The horror of thinking, once a philosophical abstraction, now manifests in the tangible chaos of our screens, proving that the mind's shackles are as real today as ever. The mind's endless capacity to think can feel like a trap, pulling us into a cycle of questions with no end in sight. We assume reason alone can conquer this chaos, but that belief only deepens the struggle. Every answer spawns a dozen more doubts. Beyond this restless search lies a simpler truth. Not everything is meant to be unraveled by human thought. There is a design at work, a wisdom that doesn't bend to our will or fit within our grasp, urging us to step back and recognize our smallness. Accepting this doesn't stop the mind from wandering. It shifts the burden, easing the terror of infinite possibilities by pointing to a source that holds them all in balance. Behind the source stands a presence that shaped it all, ready to lighten our load and quiet our fears if we turn toward it. Perhaps the key is not to become lost in fear within this infinite ocean of the mind, but rather to accept one's helplessness and follow the path drawn by a transcendent being in the pursuit of truth and meaning. Only in this way can we grasp the false infinity of the mind and lighten the burden of being human.